You know what? It's really hard. These digital devices are powerful tools, but also very potent drugs. There's no doubt that digital media lights up the same reward pathway as drugs and alcohol. These devices and platforms were designed to be addictive, that is, to keep us scrolling and tapping long beyond what we planned for or what we want or even what's pleasurable. I think we can all relate to using this medium to a point where we don't even like it anymore and yet have difficulty getting ourselves off of it. That really speaks to the inherently reinforcing and cognitively adherent nature of this medium. It is a drug. And so, if and when and how we're crossing into addictive use, I think we need to be very vigilant about whether that's happened in our lives. And one of the ways to do that is actually to try cutting out that particular digital medium, that website, or that behavior for a period of time long enough to experience withdrawal, potentially reset reward pathways, and then reevaluate. Because when we're in the behavior, as you yourself noted, it's very easy to rationalize, oh, I need to do this for work. Oh, I need to do this to stay in touch with my friends. Oh, I'm learning so much from this, right? And all of that may have been true initially, but may not be that true anymore. And what I often point to is the subtler signs of addiction, which are things like depression, anxiety, inattention, insomnia, restlessness. These can be early signals for our consumption entering into that addiction range, but us not realizing it because, again, we don't see cause and effect, which is why doing an experiment like I did with my romance novels, following in the footsteps of my patients and taking the advice I give them, and I gave my romance novels up for 30 days, right? Just to see okay, I think this is a problematic behavior. Can I give it up? How will I feel? And the very first day the very first 24 hours that I did not read any romance novel, any novel at all, I was astounded at my level of anxiety, restlessness, and utter insomnia. I had completely unlearned the art of putting myself to sleep without this digital narrative. And that lasted a good 10 to 14 days, completely mapping on with the amount of time it takes typically to get out of acute withdrawal. That is to say, for those neuroadaptation gremlins to hop off the pain side of the balance and for homeostasis to begin to be restored. But by the time I got to weeks 3 and 4, I felt not just better than I had in the first 2 weeks, but actually better than I had felt in a really long time. I enjoyed my kids more. I was more present for them. I enjoyed my husband more. My work seemed salient again. I had started to think, oh, maybe I should do something else. Maybe I, this work, I've been doing it a long time. It's not that interesting anymore. All of a sudden it was interesting again. Right? So you see the relativity of that hedonic pathway and how when we're doing that behavior or substance that's so reinforcing that everything else loses its salience, we can really misidentify what is causing our irritability, anxiety, insomnia until we stop that substance for long enough to see its impact on our lives. I think that romance novels are essentially socially sanctioned pornography for women. And the medium is narrative. And if you're a person for whom narrative is a powerful drug, as it is for me, a story, a narrative, a fiction, very potent since I was a child, then, it was a natural that would be the thing that I would get addicted to. And basically, just like we've hacked and bioengineered everything to make it more potent, there's a formula for writing romance novels. Like if you take a physical copy if you go to a store and you pick up a romance novel and you literally physically open it to 2/3 of the way through, you will get to the climactic scene, pun intended, right? It's engineered. I got to a point where I wouldn't even read after. I wouldn't finish the book. I would go on to the next book. And I wouldn't even read the denouement or like what happens to the characters. I didn't care.
You didn't care about
No, and
their future.
also I got to a point where I didn't care about the quality of the writing or the depth of the character. It didn't matter. It was the drug. It was that moment I was looking for. And there are a lot of free books on Amazon, some of which are high quality and some of which are not. But like, any good drug dealer knows, free samples, that's the way you hook people. I would search for these free samples, and that's part of it too, like the searching for the drug. So the upfront work you do for the drug is part of the drug, right? It's all that, the machinations and the hiding and the this and the that gets to be part of like all of the rituals surrounding it. People can get addicted to work, and part of the reason is that we've drugified work, right? When I say drugified, what do I mean? We've made it more potent, and this is true for all these drugs. We've made them more potent, more novel, more bountiful, meaning there's more of it, and more accessible. So if we break that down with work, how is work more potent? Well, certain types of work are more reinforcing, not all types of work. So for example, white-collar work is often now associated with stock options and bonuses, right? There's often like a social media aspect to it, or maybe even a fame aspect, or as you pointed out, those are our cultural heroes, right? So you get all this, adulation for being a workaholic. And that also, because we're such social creatures, right? And human connection stimulates dopamine, that also makes work more of a potent drug. And then you've got the fact of novelty. So once we've exposed our brains enough times to a certain drug, as I said, we develop tolerance, right? And then we need more potent forms or novel forms. One of the ways we overcome tolerance is by taking our drug and then changing it slightly, like adding a little new molecule on this chemical, right? Or on the internet, when we're searching videos, we want something similar to what we liked before, but just a little bit different. And that's what the algorithm does automatically, right? It offered, oh, you should check this out. Oh, how about this? Oh, check that out, right? And that engages our treasure-seeking function. We're looking for that novel thing, but that's not too novel, right? It has to be in our category of things we like. And I think for work, we have that too. Like there are so many ways now that people can engage in their work. And it's not all bad that it's novel, but certain types of work, it makes it very enticing. Then you have quantity, right? I mean, work never ends. There's like no natural stopping point for work. You do a line of cocaine, you run out of money, you run out of cocaine, you're done, right? But that's not true for work. Everywhere, anytime, and then that gets to accessibility. One of the biggest risk factors for addiction to any drug or behavior is simple access. We know that if you grow up in a neighborhood where drugs are sold on a street corner, you're more likely to try them, more likely to get addicted. If you live in a world where you have access to work 24/7, you're more likely to expose your brain to more work and more likely to get addicted to work. Again, especially if it's got all those other reinforcing qualities.
This is probably in part why people quit their jobs.
You mean if they just get overwhelmed? Or it's partially why people can never quit. But I think it's important to make a distinction between work that's reinforcing in those ways and then work that's completely not reinforcing,
Yeah.
alienating, mind-numbing, work in which the actual task is separated from the meaning of a task. Many people change jobs every 2 to 3 years. I recently read that the average life of a business now is like 15 years, whereas 50 years ago, it was 50 years. And there's all this turnover, all this churn, chasing novelty. Also, I do want to emphasize that people who are in work that's not like intrinsically rewarding, but is the opposite, kind of soul-sucking, that's also a risk factor for addiction because people just wait till the end of the day, till they can go home and then use a drug to numb themselves from the stress of work. Yeah, or simply opt out of the workforce, as many young men are doing now in the United States. And what we know from data that's been collected is many of them are playing video games, right? They've just completely opted out of the workforce. Maybe that's partially true, but even people doing like doctors and lawyers, there are
Oh, okay.
equal rates of alcoholism among those groups. I think what's happening there, though, is that the nature of the work is just so stressful, whether it's white collar or blue
Okay.
collar, that there's this kind of work hard, play hard, right? Where I'm going to work all day, and at the end of the day, I'm going to reward myself. So now you've got a pleasure-pain balance that's going pleasure, pain, pleasure, pain. And remember, the biological definition of stress is any deviation from neutrality, so that every time our brain has to work to restore a level balance, we're actually triggering our stress response, triggering our own adrenaline. It's stressful to have to restore the balance from those extremes of pleasure and pain. I really think that it depends on the person, and we've got to look at drug of choice. Right. I mean, potent drugs like methamphetamine, like opioids, like alcohol, like nicotine, like cannabis, are going to be very reinforcing for many people, but not for all people. And most people do have their one drug that they sort of prefer above all others. So although generally speaking, intoxicants release a lot of dopamine in the reward pathway, I think every person is going to be different. And also, we don't really have good ways of measuring absolute values of dopamine in human beings, right? We can do that in rats, but we can't really do that in humans. It's relative values.
I've got this picture here which shows what looks like brain scans in a normal person, but then in someone who's addicted to different substances. I'll put this on the screen and I'll link it below in the description for anyone that needs it and wants to see it. But it effectively shows the impact that like cocaine has on the brain, meth, alcohol, and heroin. What is going on here?
So the red in this image represents dopamine transmission.
Okay.
So how much dopamine is being released from the presynaptic neuron, crossing that synapse, binding to receptors on the postsynaptic neuron, how much dopamine is kind of swirling around in the reward pathway part of the brain. And what this image shows is that on the left-hand side, in healthy control subjects who do not have addiction, there's plenty of red, right? So there's plenty of dopamine transmission in the reward pathway, specifically here in the nucleus accumbens. But if you look at the right-hand column, you'll see that in these individuals who have been using cocaine, methamphetamine, alcohol, and heroin in addictive ways, there's almost no red, which means there's decreased or below normal levels of dopamine transmission. They are in a chronic dopamine deficit state. This is evidence of the brain trying to compensate for too much dopamine being triggered by downregulating its own dopamine production and transmission, not just to baseline, but below baseline. And importantly, these individuals who are addicted to these substances, these brain scans were done 2 weeks after they stopped using.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, which tells us that this dopamine deficit state persists for some period of time.
For how long?
Well, it depends on the person, but we know at least from this experiment that the first 2 weeks are this persistent dopamine deficit state, which is consistent with acute withdrawal, right? People feel, when they first stop their drug of choice, they feel terrible, right? They experience all of the symptoms of physical withdrawal that correspond with that particular drug they were using, usually the opposite of what the drug did, plus the universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance or behavior: anxiety, irritability, insomnia, depression, and craving. Now, if they can get through the first 10 to 14 days, what we see clinically is those acute withdrawal symptoms slowly start to get better. And we think that that is mapping on to regenerating dopamine transmission in the reward pathway. And if they can make it to a month, that's usually the point for on average, based on clinical experience, when people really can start to get out of that constant state of craving for their drug of choice and begin to see some light at the end of the tunnel for what their lives might look like if they can maintain abstinence from their drug.